Thomas Nakamura opened the mailbag marked for Little Tokyo. Fresh blood soaked through the bottom corner, still warm. The postal route sheet inside showed 17 addresses crossed out in red ink, Japanese characters written beside each one, the same characters carved into his father's chest 3 months ago. Footsteps echoed in the sorting facility hallway above, getting louder. Someone was coming early. March 1946 marked a turning point in the lives of thousands of Japanese Americans who had survived 3 years of internment camps scattered across the western United States, their constitutional rights suspended by Executive Order 9066, despite the fact that not a single Japanese American had been convicted of espionage or sabotage throughout the entire war. Thomas Nakamura returned to San Francisco, carrying more than just his military discharge papers and the medals he had earned serving with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Italy and France, where his unit became the most decorated in American military history, while their families remained imprisoned behind barbed wire for the duration of the conflict. He carried the weight of his father's unsolved murder, a crime that local police had dismissed as a random robbery, despite the ritualistic mutilation of the body and the Japanese characters carved into the victim's chest that matched symbols used by nationalist collaborators during the occupation of Manchuria. The federal government, which had imprisoned his family for 3 years based solely on their ancestry and without any evidence of disloyalty to the United States, now showed no interest in investigating the systematic killings of Japanese Americans who had remained loyal and refused to renounce their citizenship, even under extreme pressure from both American authorities and Japanese nationalist groups operating within the camps. Thomas had spent 18 months with the Military Intelligence Service in the Pacific Theater, interrogating Japanese prisoners and translating captured documents on islands from Saipan to Okinawa, where he learned that Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast in August 1945 had fractured Japanese military and civilian populations into competing factions. Some accepted defeat and prepared for occupation, while others viewed surrender as the ultimate betrayal of centuries of warrior tradition and began organizing resistance cells that would continue fighting even after official hostilities ended. His work gave him access to intelligence reports about ultranationalist groups like the Kempeitai and Black Dragon Society members who had operated in California before the war, recruiting among Japanese immigrant communities and pressuring families to maintain loyalty to the emperor rather than their adopted country. These groups had gone underground after Pearl Harbor, but Thomas knew from interrogating prisoners that their organizational structures remained intact and their ideology had only grown more extreme with Japan's defeat. When he returned to San Francisco and found his father murdered with those specific characters carved into his flesh, Thomas understood immediately that this was not random violence, but an execution carried out by operatives who viewed Japanese Americans serving in the United States military as traitors deserving death. The Los Angeles Federal Building Postal Facility, where Thomas now worked, stood 12 stories above Spring Street, its Art Deco facade concealing the bureaucratic machinery that processed hundreds of thousands of documents and packages daily for the Western Regional Mail System that connected California to the rest of the nation. Thomas had deliberately sought employment here after his honorable discharge, spending 2 weeks memorizing the building's layout, shift changes, security protocols, and the location of every restricted area, including the basement mail sorting facility that operated with minimal supervision between 5 and 7 each morning. The facility processed mail bound for Japanese American neighborhoods across Southern California, a responsibility that gave Thomas access to correspondence patterns, return addresses, and the physical handling of every piece of mail that moved through Little Tokyo, Boyle Heights, and the dozen other communities where former internees had attempted to rebuild their lives after losing businesses, homes, and years of their existence to government-sanctioned imprisonment. He worked the early morning shift with minimal oversight, which allowed him to examine mail without raising suspicion from postal supervisors who viewed him as just another veteran grateful for steady federal employment in a city where most businesses still refused to hire Japanese Americans, regardless of their military service. Thomas had noticed the pattern 3 weeks earlier when he began finding packages addressed to the same 17 families, each containing what appeared to be Buddhist religious materials, but with weight distributions that suggested hidden compartments and construction techniques inconsistent with legitimate religious publishing. The packages arrived on irregular schedules from different cities across California, Oregon, and Washington, but always during periods when specific sorting staff were on duty and always routed through processing stations where security cameras had convenient blind spots. He had photographed 12 of these packages using a Minox subminiature camera that military intelligence had trained him to operate during his Pacific service, documenting sender addresses, postal marks, and the distinctive way each package was wrapped using traditional Japanese furoshiki cloth techniques that varied by region, and suggested the senders were coordinating their activities across multiple states. When he opened one package 2 days ago and found detailed maps of federal buildings in Sacramento and Portland, alongside lists of Japanese-American families marked with red ink notations, Thomas understood he had discovered something far larger than his father's individual murder. The footsteps stopped outside the sorting room door. A key turned in the lock. Thomas shoved the bloody mailbag behind sorting bins marked for San Diego routes. The door opened to reveal a postal supervisor named Richard Kaczynski, a third-generation Polish-American who had worked at the facility for 11 years and was scheduled to arrive 90 minutes later according to the shift roster. Kaczynski held a clipboard, but his eyes went immediately to the little Tokyo sorting bin where Thomas stood. His right hand moved toward his jacket pocket with the practiced motion of someone reaching for a concealed weapon rather than postal paperwork. Thomas dropped flat as Kaczynski drew a Nambu Type 14 pistol, the same model carried by Japanese officers during the war. The first shot shattered the sorting bin above his head, scattering envelopes across the concrete floor. Thomas rolled behind a mail cart and yanked the fire alarm mounted on the support column. Bells erupted throughout the building. Kaczynski fired twice more, bullets punching through canvas mailbags. Thomas grabbed a sorting tray and hurled it at the overhead lights. Glass exploded. The room went dark except for emergency exit signs. He heard Kaczynski moving toward the emergency exit, running, getting away. Thomas reached the hallway 30 seconds behind Kaczynski, but found only an abandoned clipboard with 3 names written in Japanese characters, the same characters from his father's chest, and the crossed-out addresses in the bloody mailbag. The names meant purification, loyalty, and sacrifice. Building security arrived 7 minutes later to find Thomas standing in the sorting room surrounded by scattered mail and broken glass, 3 bullet holes in the walls, and a Japanese pistol lying beside the fire alarm panel where Kaczynski had dropped it while fleeing. The Los Angeles Police Department dismissed his statement after a 15-minute interview, suggesting he had manufactured the entire incident to cover theft of postal materials, a crime that carried federal prosecution and would revoke his veteran benefits. The postal facility supervisor suspended him pending investigation. Thomas walked out of the federal building at 9:30 that morning, knowing 3 things with absolute certainty. First, the nationalist cell that murdered his father had infiltrated the United States Postal Service at multiple levels. Second, they were using the mail system to coordinate a network that spanned at least 12 western states. Third, the authorities would never investigate because doing so would require admitting that the same government that imprisoned Japanese Americans without cause had also failed to protect them from organized murder after their release. Thomas found Daniel Yoshida in a basement print shop on East 1st Street in Little Tokyo, operating a Heidelberg press that produced wedding invitations and funeral programs for the Japanese-American community that had cautiously begun returning to Los Angeles after the camps closed. Daniel had served 3 years with the 100th Infantry Battalion before transferring to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, where he earned 2 Purple Hearts during the rescue of the lost battalion in the Vosges Mountains of France, an operation that cost the Nisei Regiment 800 casualties, to save 211 trapped Texas soldiers who had ignored warnings about German positions. The print shop belonged to Daniel's uncle, who had lost his original business to forced sale in 1942, when Executive Order 9066 gave Japanese Americans 10 days to liquidate property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, assets that white buyers purchased for pennies on the dollar. While the government promised to protect abandoned properties, but instead allowed systematic looting that destroyed 3 generations of accumulated wealth. Daniel had returned from Europe to find his family living in a converted garage behind the print shop, subsisting on his veteran disability payments, while his uncle attempted to rebuild a customer base among the few Japanese Americans who had resources remaining after internment, and among the even smaller number of white customers willing to conduct business with people they had supported imprisoning 3 years earlier. Thomas spread 12 photographs across the printing table, each showing packages with hidden compartments, maps of federal buildings, and lists of Japanese American families marked for execution by nationalist operatives who viewed collaboration with the United States as treason deserving death under the traditional samurai code of Bushido that placed loyalty to the emperor above individual survival or family welfare. Daniel studied each photograph in silence, his printer-stained fingers tracing the Japanese characters that Thomas had documented during his 3 weeks of covert surveillance at the postal facility before his suspension following the confrontation with Kozinski. The characters used classical kanji forms that had been standard during the Meiji era, but had fallen out of common usage by 1946, suggesting the operatives were either educated in Japan before emigrating or had received training from handlers who maintained traditional linguistic practices as a marker of ideological purity. Daniel recognized 3 of the families on the execution lists, including a grocery store owner in Boyle Heights, who had publicly testified before Congress in 1944 about conditions in the internment camps, and a Buddhist priest in Sacramento who had counseled young men to register for the military draft despite their family's imprisonment, actions that nationalist groups viewed as collaboration with the enemy and betrayal of Japanese cultural identity. The map showed federal buildings in 12 cities across California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Arizona, each marked with entry points, security patrol schedules, and interior layouts that could only have been obtained through systematic surveillance conducted over months by operatives with access to restricted government facilities. Thomas explained that the nationalist network had infiltrated the Postal Service at multiple levels, placing operatives in sorting facilities, delivery routes, and administrative positions where they could monitor correspondence between Japanese American families and identify individuals who maintained contact with government officials, civil rights organizations, or Christian churches that the nationalists viewed as tools of American cultural imperialism designed to destroy traditional Japanese identity. The network used the postal system to coordinate activities across state lines, moving weapons, documents, and operatives through mail routes, while exploiting the constitutional protections against warrantless search of mail to create an invisible communications infrastructure that federal authorities either could not or would not investigate. Kozinski represented just one node in an organization that Thomas estimated included at least 50 postal employees and potentially hundreds of active operatives, a counterintelligence network that had survived intact through the war years by maintaining strict operational security and by exploiting the fact that government resources focused on imprisoning loyal Japanese Americans rather than investigating actual threats from nationalist groups who had operated in California since the 1920s. Daniel asked why Thomas had come to him rather than taking the evidence to military intelligence or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, organizations with resources and authority to conduct the kind of investigation that 2 suspended veterans could not possibly accomplish alone. Thomas showed Daniel the final photograph, taken outside the Los Angeles Police Department headquarters 3 days after the shooting incident at the postal facility. The image captured Kozinski entering the building through a side entrance reserved for police personnel and authorized visitors, suggesting either active cooperation between the nationalist network and law enforcement or successful infiltration that had placed operatives or sympathizers in positions where they could monitor investigations, suppress evidence, and protect the organization from official scrutiny. Thomas had spent the previous week conducting surveillance on 6 police officers who had dismissed his initial report about his father's murder, documenting 2 meetings between these officers and known associates of pre-war nationalist organizations like the Black Dragon Society and the Military Virtue Society, groups that had recruited among Japanese immigrants by combining cultural preservation rhetoric with ultranationalist ideology that viewed the United States as a decadent civilization, destined for destruction. The depth of infiltration suggested that approaching federal authorities would simply alert the network and trigger the execution of families currently under surveillance, while any attempt to publicly expose the conspiracy would be dismissed as paranoid fantasies. From bitter internment camp survivors seeking revenge against the government that had imprisoned them without cause or due process. Daniel folded the photographs and asked what Thomas proposed to do with evidence that no authority would investigate, and that would likely result in their deaths if the nationalist network discovered their surveillance activities. Thomas outlined a plan that would require recruiting 6 additional veterans from the Military Intelligence Service and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, men with combat experience, Japanese language skills, and most importantly, motivation to protect families that the government had abandoned. They would infiltrate the Postal Service by obtaining legitimate employment through veteran hiring preferences, positioning themselves in facilities where Thomas had identified nationalist operatives. They would document the network's communications, track operatives across state lines, and systematically identify every member of the organization before conducting a coordinated series of apprehensions that would happen simultaneously across multiple states, preventing the network from scattering or executing their target families. The operation would require functioning outside legal authority since they had no arrest powers, but Thomas argued that 3 years of unconstitutional imprisonment had demonstrated that Japanese Americans could not rely on legal protections and would need to defend themselves through whatever means proved necessary. The print shop door opened. 3 men entered without knocking. Thomas recognized the lead figure from intelligence photographs, a former Kempeitai officer named Takeshi Yamada, who had operated in Los Angeles before Pearl Harbor, recruiting for nationalist organizations. Yamada held a Colt 1911 pistol pointed at Daniel's chest. The 2 men flanking him carried military-issue carbines. Nobody spoke. The printing press continued running in the background, producing wedding invitations that would never be delivered. Yamada's eyes moved from Daniel to Thomas. Recognition. He raised the pistol toward Thomas's head. Daniel hit the emergency power switch. The print shop went black. Gunfire erupted. Muzzle flashes illuminated the room in stuttering snapshots. Thomas dropped behind the Heidelberg press as bullets sparked off metal components. Daniel yanked open the floor panel that accessed the building's original basement, a bootlegger's escape route from Prohibition days. They dropped through as carbine rounds chewed through the wooden floor above. The basement tunnel led 3 buildings east. Behind them, footsteps pounded on the print shop floor, Yamada shouting orders in Japanese. They had perhaps 90 seconds before the operatives found the tunnel entrance. The tunnel terminated in a storage basement beneath a Chinese grocery on Alameda Street, a space that had once concealed illegal alcohol during federal prohibition enforcement and now housed inventory for a family that had maintained their business throughout the war years, while their Japanese-American neighbors lost everything to forced evacuation and property confiscation. Thomas and Daniel emerged through a false wall behind stacked rice bags, their clothes torn from crawling through 60 feet of brick passage that had not been maintained since the 1930s, their hands bleeding from sharp edges where mortar had crumbled away over decades of disuse. The grocery owner, a man named Chen who had purchased Japanese-American properties at government auctions and then quietly held them in trust for families who might someday return from the camps, asked no questions when he saw them come through his basement wall covered in brick dust and blood. He simply locked the street entrance, switched off the main lights to suggest the store had closed for the day, and handed them clean shirts from his inventory, while Daniel used the basement sink to wash away evidence of their escape through the bootlegger's tunnel that had saved them from certain execution by Yamada's operatives, who would not hesitate to kill witnesses. Thomas and Daniel spent the next 4 days moving between safe houses in Los Angeles' scattered Japanese-American community, staying no more than 8 hours in any location while they made contact with potential recruits for the operation that Thomas had outlined in the print shop minutes before Yamada's attack interrupted their planning session. Each recruit needed to satisfy multiple requirements that would make them effective operatives, capable of infiltrating the nationalist network while maintaining cover as legitimate postal workers rebuilding their lives after military service and internment camp imprisonment. They needed fluency in both English and Japanese, including classical kanji literacy, that would allow them to understand the coded communications that nationalist operatives used in their correspondence, a skill that limited potential recruits to Nisei who had attended Japanese language schools before the war, or who had served with the military intelligence service, where they received intensive training in military terminology and document translation. They needed combat experience that would prepare them for violence if their cover was compromised, which meant veterans from frontline infantry units like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team or from intelligence operations in the Pacific Theater, where interrogations sometimes turned deadly when prisoners chose suicide over capture. Most critically, they needed personal motivation strong enough to risk their lives for an operation that offered no official sanction, no legal protection, and no recognition if they succeeded, which meant men who had lost family members to nationalist violence, or who understood that the Japanese-American community faced systematic extermination unless someone acted outside the legal structures that had already failed to provide protection or justice. Robert Tanaka had served with the Military Intelligence Service on Okinawa, where he interrogated Japanese civilians and soldiers during the 82-day battle that killed 12,000 Americans and 100,000 Japanese in the final major campaign before the atomic bombings that ended the war. He returned to Seattle to find his younger sister murdered 3 weeks after her release from the Minidoka internment camp in Idaho, her body discovered in an alley behind the family's former grocery store with Japanese characters carved into her forehead that identified her as a traitor for working as a translator for American military authorities during her imprisonment. Seattle police closed the investigation after 48 hours, listing the cause of death as robbery, despite the fact that her purse remained untouched and the ritualistic mutilation clearly indicated ideological rather than criminal motivation. Robert had spent 11 months conducting his own investigation, tracking rumors through Seattle's Japanese-American community about nationalist recruiters who approached young men recently released from the camps with offers of employment and cultural connection, organizations that promised to restore dignity after 3 years of imprisonment, but actually served as fronts for the ultranationalist network that viewed any cooperation with American authorities as treason. When Thomas contacted him through a coded letter delivered by Chen's grocery distribution network, Robert agreed to join the operation within 6 hours, abandoning his job as a dock worker to travel to Los Angeles, where he would begin training for Postal Service employment that would position him in Seattle's main sorting facility, where Thomas had identified 3 suspected operatives based on patterns in mail routing and suspicious packages similar to those he had discovered before his confrontation with Kozinski. Frank Saito brought different qualifications to the operation, having served as a combat medic with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team during the Italian campaign, where he treated casualties under fire during the Battle for Monte Cassino and the rescue of the Lost Battalion in France. His medical training proved invaluable, not only for treating wounds that might result from confrontations with nationalist operatives, but also for understanding the psychological methods that cult-like organizations use to recruit and control members, knowledge he had gained while treating Japanese prisoners of war who demonstrated symptoms of indoctrination so severe that many chose suicide rather than accept the reality of Japan's defeat. Frank's father had survived the Tule Lake Segregation Center, the camp where the government imprisoned Japanese Americans who answered no to the loyalty questionnaire that demanded they renounce allegiance to the Japanese emperor and declare willingness to serve in the United States military. Questions that many viewed as insulting traps since they had never held allegiance to Japan in the first place. His father's experience gave Frank insight into the psychological vulnerability that nationalist recruiters exploited, targeting men who felt betrayed by both the American government that imprisoned them and the Japanese-American community leaders who counseled cooperation with authorities, creating a population desperate for identity and purpose that ultranationalist ideology promised to provide through violence and revenge. Thomas recruited 4 additional veterans over the following week, each bringing specialized skills that would prove essential for an operation that required not only infiltration and surveillance, but also the ability to function as an autonomous unit without support from official authorities. George Taniguchi had worked as a postal carrier in Portland before the war and understood mail routing systems, sorting procedures, and the bureaucratic processes that would allow the team to obtain legitimate employment while avoiding background checks that might alert nationalist sympathizers in personnel departments. William Fujimoto had studied law at the University of California before internment interrupted his education, giving him knowledge of federal regulations governing postal operations and the legal frameworks they would need to navigate while conducting what amounted to an unsanctioned counterintelligence operation. Samuel Okada brought expertise in photography and document forgery from his work with the Military Intelligence Service, skills that would prove critical for creating false identities and documenting evidence in ways that could eventually support prosecutions if they succeeded in exposing the nationalist network. Edward Kimura had served with Army intelligence in occupied Japan after the surrender, where he developed contacts with Japanese officials who were cooperating with American authorities and who might provide information about nationalist groups that had fled to the United States rather than face prosecution in post-war tribunals that were executing leaders of organizations like the Black Dragon Society and the Military Virtue Society for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The 7 men gathered in a warehouse in San Pedro that Daniel's uncle had arranged through his business connections with dock workers who controlled access to waterfront facilities where goods moved between ships and trains without excessive government oversight or security scrutiny. Thomas spread maps across a cargo container, showing postal facilities in 12 western states where they would position themselves over the following 6 months, gradually building employment records and gaining access to the internal systems that nationalist operatives were using to coordinate their network. The operation required patience and methodical execution rather than immediate action, since any premature move would alert the organization and trigger the execution of the 1,372 targets that Thomas estimated were currently under surveillance based on the lists he had photographed before Kaczynski discovered him in the sorting facility. Each team member would work independently in different cities, documenting operatives and communications while maintaining cover as ordinary postal workers struggling to rebuild their lives after war and internment, creating a counter-network that would mirror the nationalist organization's structure while remaining invisible until the moment they chose to act simultaneously across all 12 states. Daniel stood at the warehouse entrance, watching the street for surveillance. He raised his hand. Everyone stopped talking. A car had parked across from the warehouse entrance, engine still running. 2 men sitting in front, not moving, just watching. Thomas recognized the vehicle model, a black Packard sedan identical to one he had photographed outside the print shop 2 hours before Yamada's attack. The men in the front seat were not looking at the warehouse. They were looking at their mirrors, watching for people approaching from behind, setting up a perimeter. More cars would be coming. Thomas made the decision in 3 seconds. The warehouse had 2 exits, one facing the street where the Packard waited, and one leading to the loading docks that opened directly onto the waterfront where cargo ships unloaded 24 hours a day under floodlights that would make them visible targets the moment they stepped outside. The nationalist operatives had chosen their position perfectly, forcing anyone inside the warehouse to either surrender or attempt escape through a kill zone with no cover. Daniel moved to the loading dock exit anyway, pulling the heavy steel door open 6 inches to assess their tactical situation. 4 more cars had arrived in the 2 minutes since he first spotted the Packard, positioning themselves at intervals along the waterfront access road that connected the warehouse district to San Pedro's main port facilities. The vehicles carried at least 12 operatives based on the silhouettes visible through windows, men who had military training and weapons that would cut down anyone attempting to run across 300 feet of open concrete between the warehouse and the nearest cover. Thomas counted their ammunition, finding exactly 47 rounds distributed among the 7 men in their group, most of them carrying only the single magazine that fit their personal sidearms since they had not anticipated needing combat loadouts for what was supposed to be a planning meeting in a secure location that Daniel's uncle had assured them would remain unknown to nationalist surveillance. The situation represented exactly the kind of tactical problem that Thomas had encountered dozens of times during his military intelligence service work in the Pacific Theater, where small units found themselves isolated behind enemy lines with superior forces closing in and no possibility of reinforcement or extraction. The solution always involved doing something unexpected that forced the enemy to react, rather than execute their planned assault, creating confusion that could be exploited during the critical seconds when opposing forces tried to adapt to changing circumstances. Thomas climbed the warehouse interior stairs to the second-level catwalk that ran along the building's full perimeter, providing access to ventilation systems and electrical panels that required periodic maintenance. The catwalk terminated at a service hatch that opened onto the roof, a flat expanse of tar paper and gravel that absorbed summer heat and provided mounting points for the crane system that moved cargo between the warehouse floor and trucks positioned at loading docks. The roof offered no escape route, but it did offer elevation and the element of surprise against operatives who would be watching ground-level exits while expecting their targets to attempt a desperate run toward the waterfront or a barricaded defense inside the warehouse that would allow nationalist forces to simply wait until police arrived and arrested the Japanese-American veterans for trespassing and weapons violations. Thomas positioned Frank and Samuel on the roof with instructions to wait exactly 4 minutes before firing at the vehicles blocking the waterfront access road, aiming for engine blocks and tires rather than personnel, since their limited ammunition would not sustain a prolonged firefight, and since killing nationalist operatives would transform them from victims defending themselves into criminals who had murdered American citizens regardless of the fact that those citizens were attempting to execute them. The remaining 5 men gathered at the loading dock exit, with Daniel carrying the only rifle in their group, a Springfield 1903 that he had kept from his military service, despite regulations requiring veterans to turn in combat weapons upon discharge. Thomas gave Daniel the 3-second signal. Daniel kicked open the loading dock door and sprinted toward the nearest cargo container, positioned 40 feet from the warehouse, drawing fire from at least 6 operatives who opened up with pistols and carbines that sparked off concrete and metal surfaces. The covering fire from the roof erupted exactly on schedule, Frank and Samuel firing controlled pairs at the vehicles, blocking escape routes, while Thomas and the remaining 3 men used the distraction to reach the cargo container where Daniel had taken cover behind 8 tons of steel that would stop any small arms fire the nationalist operatives could bring to bear. The waterfront erupted in chaos as dock workers abandoned their shifts and fled toward the port facilities, while ship's crews secured their vessels and stevedores dove behind cargo pallets and shipping containers that transformed the entire area into a maze of cover and concealment, where neither side could maneuver without exposing themselves to fire from multiple directions. Thomas led the team through the container yard, using techniques he had learned fighting in Pacific Island jungles, where visibility rarely exceeded 20 feet and every corner concealed potential ambush positions. They moved in pairs with one man covering, while another advanced, leapfrogging through gaps between containers until they reached the port's main entrance, where civilian vehicles created a natural barrier between them and pursuing nationalist operatives who would not risk opening fire in an area crowded with dock workers and police who were already responding to reports of gunfire at the waterfront. The entire escape from warehouse to port entrance took 11 minutes and consumed 31 of their 47 rounds, leaving them with minimal ammunition, but alive and free to continue the operation that nationalist forces had attempted to destroy before it could begin gathering the evidence needed to expose their network and protect the 1,372 Japanese-American families marked for execution. The failed ambush at the San Pedro warehouse forced Thomas to accelerate his operational timeline and modify his tactical approach to infiltrating the nationalist network, without giving operatives additional opportunities to identify and eliminate his team before they could position themselves in postal facilities across the western states. Instead of the careful 6-month infiltration he had originally planned, Thomas compressed the timeline to 8 weeks by exploiting veteran hiring preferences that gave military service members priority for federal employment positions, a program that postal supervisors could not refuse, without facing congressional scrutiny about discrimination against returning soldiers who had sacrificed to defend their country. George Taniguchi obtained employment at Portland's main sorting facility within 12 days by presenting his pre-war postal experience and his honorable discharge from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, credentials that overcame initial resistance from supervisors who privately expressed concerns about hiring Japanese Americans. but could not legally refuse without violating federal regulations. Robert Tanaka secured a position in Seattle using similar methods, while Samuel Okada and Edward Kimura placed themselves in San Francisco and Sacramento facilities, where Thomas had identified suspicious mail patterns during his original surveillance at the Los Angeles Postal Building. William Fujimoto and Frank Saito remained in Southern California, with William working in the Los Angeles facility, where Thomas had been suspended, and Frank obtaining employment in the San Diego sorting center that processed mail for military bases and defense installations along the Mexican border. Over the following 31 months from August 1946 through March 1949, the seven-man team systematically documented every aspect of the Nationalist Network's operations across 12 Western states, photographing thousands of pieces of correspondence that revealed the organization's command structure, financing methods, recruitment techniques, and most critically, the complete list of Japanese-American families targeted for execution because they had served in the military, testified about internment camp conditions, maintained relationships with Christian organizations, or otherwise demonstrated loyalty to the United States that nationalist ideology defined as cultural betrayal. The team operated with extraordinary discipline and patience, resisting the temptation to intervene when they identified individual operatives or discovered evidence of planned attacks, instead allowing the network to continue functioning while they built comprehensive documentation that would enable simultaneous apprehension of operatives across multiple states before any could escape or execute their targets in response to arrests of their colleagues. Thomas established a secure communications system using coded letters routed through Chen's grocery distribution network, allowing team members to share intelligence without using postal channels that nationalist operatives controlled or telephone lines that could be monitored by sympathizers in law enforcement agencies. Each team member maintained detailed logbooks written in both English and Japanese, documenting observations in language that could serve as evidence in future prosecutions, while also creating psychological profiles of operatives that analyze their motivations, vulnerabilities, and the indoctrination techniques that had transformed them from ordinary immigrants or American-born citizens into ideological extremists willing to murder their own community members for perceived disloyalty to a nation that most had never visited and an emperor who had surrendered 4 years earlier. The final phase of the operation began on March 15, 1949, when Thomas coordinated simultaneous actions across all 12 states during a 6-hour window that prevented nationalist operatives from warning each other about arrests. The team had identified 1,372 active network members, including postal employees, business owners, religious organization leaders, and seemingly ordinary members of Japanese-American communities who maintained cover identities while conducting surveillance on target families and preparing execution orders that would be carried out if the nationalist leadership gave the signal. Thomas had spent 11 months working with a single sympathetic FBI agent named Patrick Sullivan, a second-generation Irish-American who had investigated organized crime in Chicago before transferring to Los Angeles, and who understood that official channels had been compromised by nationalist infiltration at multiple levels. Sullivan provided the legal framework that allowed the apprehensions to proceed as citizens' arrests, supported by overwhelming documentary evidence, while also ensuring that federal marshals, rather than local police, conducted the actual detentions to prevent sympathizers from interfering with prosecutions. The operation's scale shocked federal authorities, who had dismissed Thomas's initial reports as paranoid fantasies, but now confronted evidence of the largest domestic counterintelligence network discovered since the Civil War, an organization that had operated for decades without detection, and that had murdered at least 13 Japanese-American families before Thomas began his investigation. The exposure of the nationalist network in 1950 produced immediate legislative response when Congress passed the Federal Postal Inspection Act, creating independent oversight mechanisms for postal service security and establishing protocols for investigating employee misconduct that could not be suppressed by supervisors who might be compromised by infiltration or sympathetic to extremist ideologies. More significantly, the case provided the first official recognition that Japanese Americans who had endured 3 years of unconstitutional imprisonment had also faced systematic violence from nationalist groups that the government had failed to identify or prevent, despite having extensive intelligence about these organizations' pre-war activities. The 7 veterans who conducted the operation received no public recognition for their work, since official acknowledgement would have required admitting that federal authorities had abandoned Japanese American communities to organized murder after releasing them from internment camps. Thomas Nakamura returned to work at the Los Angeles Postal Facility under his real name after prosecutors granted immunity for the team's activities during their unauthorized investigation. He worked there until his retirement in 1978. 46 years after the operation's conclusion, the Central Intelligence Agency declassified documents related to post-war counterintelligence activities in occupied Japan and the Western United States. The files revealed that Thomas Nakamura's team had documented not only the nationalist network's domestic operations, but also its connections to ultranationalist groups that American intelligence had recruited for Cold War operations against communist movements in Asia, organizations that the government had chosen to protect despite their responsibility for murdering American citizens. The declassified detention records contain psychological profiles of all 1,372 operatives, each profile written in both English and Japanese, with detailed analysis of how ordinary people had been transformed into ideological extremists through systematic indoctrination that exploited legitimate grievances about racial discrimination and internment camp imprisonment. The confessions documented methods of recruitment, financing from Japanese business interests that had survived the war, and plans for expanded operations that would have targeted not only Japanese Americans, but also other Asian immigrant communities that nationalist ideology viewed as corrupted by Western values. The documents remain available at the National Archives, testament to an operation conducted by 7 men who received no official sanction, no legal protection, and no recognition until decades after their work prevented what would have become the largest domestic terrorist campaign in American history.